And welcome to Technology Tap. I'm Professor J. Rod. In this episode, understanding the different Windows editions. Let's tap in. All right, welcome to Technology Tap. I'm Professor J. Rod. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a professor of cybersecurity, and I love helping my students pass their A+, Network Plus, and Security Plus series of exams. I also wrote a book called Scam Proof for Seniors. It's available on Amazon or my website, professorjrod.com/books. It's a book to help your parents and grandparents stay away from scammers. If you want to email me, you can email me at professorjrod@gmail.com. You can follow me on Instagram at professorjrod, on Facebook at Technology Tap Podcast, at TikTok at professorjrod. I think I covered it all. Yes. All right. Let me tell you something most people never realize. The moment you choose a Windows edition, you're already deciding the future of that machine. Not when you install apps, not when you connect it to the network, not when you troubleshoot it, but right there at the very beginning. And this is where beginners and even some techs get it wrong. You've heard it all before. Somebody says, just install Windows. But here's the problem. That sentence is incomplete because there's no such thing as just Windows. There are versions, layers, capabilities, restrictions, and purpose. And if you don't understand the difference, you're not installing an operating system. You're installing a future problem. So let's step into a real situation. You called into a small business. They said, we just bought 10 new laptops. Can you set them up? Simple enough. You install Windows, everything is clean, everything boots fast, users log in. And then problem starts. They can't connect to the company server, files aren't synchronizing properly, security policies aren't applying, IT can't manage devices remotely, and then someone asks, why isn't it working? And then you realized you installed Windows Home. Because now you understand something critical. The OS edition determines what is even possible. Not performance, not speed, but capability. Let's break this down. Windows Home is designed for personal users, family, basic computing. Think browsing, streaming, email, live productivity. And for that, it's perfect. But here's what it doesn't do, right? This is where the technician mindset kicks in. Windows Home does not support domain join, BitLocker encryption, group policy management, and advanced remote administrations. And that means the moment you move into a business environment, Windows Home becomes a dead end. Think of Windows Home like a home, right? You're comfortable, independent, self-managed. Now think of a business environment like a corporate building, centralized control, security policies, shared resources, structured access. Now imagine trying to run a corporate building using house rules. It doesn't work. If you install Windows Home in a business environment, you didn't just make a mistake, you created a technical debt. Now we step into Windows Pro, and this is when things shift. This is no longer about using a computer. This is about managing a computer. Windows Pro introduces us to domain join. Now your machine can connect to a domain controller, which means centralized authentication, user policy, and policy enforcement. It has BitLocker. This is a full disk encryption. If the device is stolen, data is protected. This is not an option in business. This is expected. Remote desktop. Now you can access machines remotely, support users, and work from anywhere. Group policy. This is where the real control begins. You can enforce password rules, lock down settings, control updates, and standardize environments. What just happened? You went from a standalone machine to a control system inside an environment. Small business scenario. Same 10 laptops, but this time you installed Windows Pro. Now all devices join the domain. The user logs in with company credentials. Security policies apply instantly. And IT manages everything centrally. And then suddenly, everything works. So what's the takeaway? The difference wasn't hardware, it wasn't speed, it wasn't user behavior. It was the OS addition decision. Now let's go bigger, much bigger. Imagine this, 5,000 employees, multiple locations, sensitive data, compliance requirements. Now ask yourself, can Windows Home handle this? And can even Basic Pro handle this fully? Not at scale. Windows Enterprise is designed for large organizations, advanced security, and massive deployment with features like advanced threat protection, device guard, credential guard, centralized deployment tools. The key difference is Windows Pro equals management, where Windows Enterprise is control at scale. Here's another critical concept from your module. Enterprise is typically volume license, which means organizations don't buy one copy at a time. They manage licenses in bulk. At this level, you're no longer thinking, how do I install Windows? You're thinking, how do I deploy 1,000 machines effectively and securely? Now let's talk about education editions. These are designed for schools, universities, and labs. Why does it exist? Because schools need enterprise level control, but at a lower cost with a student-focused tools. Imagine a computer lab with 30 students, shared machines, and limited permissions. You need control, security, consistency. This is where Education Edition shines. Work group versus domain. This is one of the most popular concepts and one of the most tested. Work group. This is peer-to-peer, independent systems, no central control. Each machine manages itself. Problems with work group, hard to manage, no centralized security, and no unified authentication. Domain, now everything changes. A domain connects all machines, uses a domain controller, and centralizes everything. What about the benefits? One login for all systems, centralized policies, and easier management and scalability. If you see the following question on the exam, user needs centralized management, the answer involves domain plus either Windows Pro or Windows Enterprise. Now let's talk about licensing, because this shows up in questions and in real life. You typically have OEM license or retail license. OEM is tied to the device and cannot be transferred. Retail can be moved and more flexible. Why does it matter? Imagine a motherboard fails. You replace it. If it's OEM, license may be invalid. Licensing is not just legal. It affects usability. Now let's talk about planning ahead, because good technicians don't just think about today, they think about what happens next. To move from Windows 10 to Windows 11, you need TPM 2.0, UEFI with secure boot, and supported CPU. So you install Windows 10 today, but hardware isn't compatible with Windows 11. Now later, the upgrade fails, right? That's a problem. Always ask, can this system grow? Right? So let's bring it together. Installing Windows is not about clicking next. It's about choosing the right foundation. So far we learned about Windows Edition determine capability, home versus personal, pro versus personal, enterprise versus scale, and education versus control learning. Stop asking, what version should I install? Start asking, what problems am I solving? What environment am I in? And what level of control is required? All right, let's go on to 32-bit versus 64-bit. Let me ask you a question. You're installing an operating system, everything boots, no errors, no warnings. But the system feels slow, limited, constrained. And you can't quite explain why. Here's the truth. Some of the worst performance problems don't come from hardware failure. They don't come from malware. They don't come from user error. They come from something much greater, a wrong architectural decision. And that decision is installing a 32-bit operating system on a modern machine. Now, on the surface, it looks fine. The system works. Programs open, nothing crashes, but underneath it, you already limited the machine. Let's break it down right away. A 32-bit operating system can only address 4 gigabits of RAM. Runs only 32-bit OS environment, limited memory access, and older architectural design. Think of it like this. You're in a warehouse, but the system says you can only use one room. That room is 4 gigs of RAM. Even if you install 8, 16 gig, or 32 gig, the system ignores the rest. A user comes to you and says, my computer is slow, but I just upgraded the RAM. You check, RAM's installed 16 gig, but the operating system is 32-bit. And now you realize the system is only using 4 gigs, right? Because a 32-bit system only takes up to 4 gig. The other 12 gig, completely wasted. This is when the beginners say, oh, that's weird, but the technician says that's the architecture. Now let's flip the script. A 64-bit operating system supports massive RAM, runs both 32 and 64-bit applications, optimized for modern CPUs, and enables high-performance workloads. Back to our warehouse example. With 64-bit, you can unlock the entire building. Now, every room is usable, storage expands, and efficiency increase. Instead of 4 gig limit, you now have 8, 16, 32, and 128 gigs and beyond. Installing 64-bit OS is not about preference. It's about unlocking hardware potential. Now here's where things get interesting and where CompTIA loves to test. Can a 64-bit run a 32-bit app? Yes. This is one of the biggest advantages. A 64-bit OS can run a 64-bit applications and most 32-bit applications. But the reverse is not true. A 32-bit operating system cannot run a 64-bit application. Here's an example. A company installs a new enterprise application, but users report it won't install. You check. The operating system is 32-bit, but the software is 64. And now, the problem is not the software. The problem is the OS architecture. Here's a rule that you should always follow. Always match the OS architecture with the application requirements. Why does this matter? Well, understanding 32 versus 64-bit is not just theory. It affects RAM usage, performance, compatibility, and upgrade path. If you see on the exam, system has more than 4 gigabit of RAM, the answer almost always involves a 64-bit operating system. And that's the clue right there. Now, let's shift gears because not everything in IT is technical. Some of it is legal. Windows N's version do not include media players. Exist to comply with European Union regulations. The EU required Microsoft to remove bundled media software so that other companies can compete fairly. So a user installs Windows N and says, why can't I play videos? Because media features are removed. Sometimes problems are not technical. They are regulatory. And you have to know the rules. So let's zoom out. Most people think that performance comes from CPU, RAM, and SSD. But technicians know that performance always also depends on the operating system architecture. Think of systems like layers: hardware, firmware, operating systems, applications. If layer 3, which is the operating system, is limited, everything above it suffers. Here's a misconfigured deployment example. Imagine an organization deploys 200 machines, all with 16 gigs of RAM, but accidentally installs 32-bit Windows. Now, all the machines are underperforming, your applications is lagging, and your users are complaining. And IT says, we upgraded the hardware, why is it still slow? Because the operating system is the bottleneck. Because if you catch this, you look like a problem solver. And if you miss this, you look like you don't understand systems and you don't understand computers. Let's go deeper. When RAM is limited, system uses disk paging, performance drops, and applications lag. With 32-bit, RAM max is 4 gigs. Cannot go more than 4 gigs on a 32-bit system. And it hits its limit very quickly. With 64-bit, more RAM equals more multitasking, less disk usage, and faster response. For the user experience, same computer, 2 setups. System A is 32-bit OS with 4 gigs usable RAM. System B is 64-bit operating system with 16 gig usable RAM. The result, System A, slow, freezes, and lags. System B, smooth, responsive, effective. It's not just about specs. It's just how the OS uses those specs. Now let's connect this to installation. So you upgrade from 32 to 64. Here's the key point. You cannot do an in-place upgrade. To move from a 32-bit to a 64-bit, you must perform a clean install. That means you got to do it from scratch. Right? User says, can you upgrade my system? And you say yes, but we must back up everything because the OS must be reinstalled and data must be preserved manually. Here's a technician rule. Architecture change equals clean install required. All right, so let's lock in. 32-bit equals a limited to 4 gigs. 64-bit modern system. 64-bit runs both app types. 32-bit cannot run 64-bit apps. And Windows N version is for European Union compliance. Right? Now here's the technician mindset. Stop asking, does the system work? Start asking, is the system fully utilizing its hardware? Is the architecture limiting performance? Is this setup scalable? A system could look fine and still be misconfigured, underperformance, and inefficient because of one decision: 32 versus 64-bit. Now, I kind of have a story that it's not really 64 or 32, right? It's not really a story on that, but it's about buying a computer and then realizing that I bought the wrong one. And it's not totally my fault. So let me explain. In November of 2019, I bought a computer, just a regular plain computer. I like to change my computers. First of all, I like to change my computers every 3 or 4 years, right? I just buy a new one. I don't believe in this thing with changing parts, or I'm not a big believer of that. I just buy a brand new computer, right? So it came up on the 3-year anniversary. I just started teaching as a college professor. And in the middle of the semester, I decided to buy a new computer. This was November 2019, right? And I usually use the computer surfing the internet, PowerPoints, That's basically it, right? Watching baseball games, YouTube, right? Nothing too crazy. Then in March of 2020, and it was Windows Home, right? Again, I didn't need Pro, right? It's just very, very basic, $800 computer, right? Then COVID happens. Now I'm teaching from home. And the computer that I have is not, you can't really do, like, it wasn't that great a computer for teaching from home. It was actually really, really bad. Matter of fact, it was so bad, I don't know if any of my former students remember, the computer would shut off on me like at different times during the day for like unknown reason, right? And I never quite figured out. I still have the computer. I should try to see why I did it, but it would randomly shut off right in the middle of a lesson. So I'll be on a Zoom session with the students, and then the computer would give me the blue screen of death, right? And I had such a slow hard drive that, and then, you have things on the computer that loads. From the time I hit the reset button to the time that I can get back into the classroom was 13 minutes, right? So I would have to tell the students every day before class, hey, my computer shuts off, just hang on. It takes me 13 minutes to come back, right? And I was teaching pretty much 7 days a week almost, right? Because I was teaching at my regular job. I had a part-time job, and then I was teaching for a technical school on Saturdays and Sundays. Listen, I was home, right? You might as well just make money if you're home doing nothing, right? I mean, you couldn't do much, especially during the early days, the first year of COVID, 2020. You really couldn't do much. So I just worked. It got so bad that I finally got an SSD drive for the computer. Now, the 13 minutes from startup ended up becoming 2 minutes with the SSD. So the SSD was really a game changer. And I bought more memory. Like, I swapped out the memory, right? Because usually blue screen of death is usually either software or memory. And I bought new memory, and it would still crash. It was just random. Sometimes it wouldn't crash for a day or two. Sometimes it would crash like you wouldn't even know it. Next thing you know, it was just give me the blue screen of death. I don't know. I'm one of these guys that likes to have a lot of tabs open. So I don't know if that was one of the, if that also didn't help. And I had Windows Home operating system. And I was installing Zoom and doing virtual machines, Windows Server, Windows 11, Kali Linux. Like, I was doing it, I was doing everything. I was doing way too much. Right? And it didn't work. Finally, I got, in 2022, I didn't even wait for the 3 years. In May of 2022, it was still random, so here we are, November 2019, 2020, 2021. And then in the middle of 2022, May of 2022, I finally caved. The semester ended. I got so mad, and I went and bought this computer that I have now. It's actually really good. I have 128 gigs, i9, 32 cores, right? 3070 NVIDIA. This is when I bought it 4 years ago. So it was, everything was good. But now with AI, I've noticed that it's starting to slow down. So I should have bought a computer already. But now, because everything is so expensive, I'm going to wait and see what happens with the tariffs and all this stuff and the gas prices. because everything's a little bit on the expensive side. I kind of want to wait a little bit before I buy another computer. But I'm going to be in the market for another computer as soon as all this shenanigans stop. Because AI has, I don't know, sometimes you could hear it. I'm hearing it now that you could hear the video card spinning really, really fast every time I use AI. So I gotta get another computer. But like I tell my students, try to get another computer every 3 or 4 years. Don't just change parts, because you're going to be very limited by the motherboard on what you can and cannot change. Right? And always try to install Windows Pro. That was the other problem, right? I have Windows Pro, and I'm trying to do all this stuff for trying to try out these labs, and turns to find out that I can't do a lot of these labs because I don't have Windows Pro. So it was no bueno. No bueno at all. All right. That's it for today on this chapter. We'll do a part 2 on this lesson next week. Hope you guys are having a great day. Spring is around the corner, or spring's already here. Hopefully the weather gets better. I know on the East Coast we've been hammered by terrible weather this whole year. And a lot of people, including myself, have gotten sick. One day it's 30 degrees and the next day it's 75. And all the snow and the minus 2 degrees that we had over the winter. Hopefully the spring and summer, gets it all nice. And plus, my favorite season's here, baseball season. So let's go Yankees. Right? So until next time, right? Keep learning, keep studying, and keep tapping into technology. This has been a presentation of Little Cha Cha Productions, art by Sarah, music by Joe Kim. We're now part of the Pod Match Network. You can follow me at TikTok at Professor J-Rod, that's J-R-O-D, or you can email me at professorjrod, J-R-O-D, @gmail.com.